Good afternoon. This training module is electrical safety for leaders and managers. We'll be going over developing electrical safety programs. This module is based on NFPA70e Article 110, and I'm your narrator, Mike Capel, for this training module. So the objectives for this module is we want to become familiar with the hierarchy of controls and how it applies to electrical safety. We want to understand employer and employee responsibilities in regards to electrical safety. We want to understand the components of an effective electrical safety program, and part of that means we want to understand the importance of effective training and the importance of documentation. This training has been developed with some assumptions about the participants in mind. The first assumption is that you have some electrical trade experience. You're familiar with the terms, the quote-unquote glossary of the industry, that you are aware of electrical safety concepts and the related terminology. That means at some point in your career you've gone through some type of arc flash and shock hazard awareness training. A key assumption is that you are a leader in your organization. And the reason this is a key is because I feel strongly that leaders and managers have to be passionate advocates for safety. That means it's a responsibility inherent to the role of being a manager, being a leader, that we have to advocate and relentlessly advocate for the safety of the people that get the work done. Why develop this training? Well, most training focuses on technicians, and rightfully so. It's important that technicians are trained in recognizing and mitigating shock hazard awareness, arc flash awareness. I've seen very often where that's pretty much the extent of our quote-unquote electrical safety program. Hey, we're going to go through an 8-hour course. You're going to understand. We're going to throw some PPE at you. And then from that point, it's an individual responsibility to make sure we're doing the right things. And I kind of want to turn that idea on its head and say, as managers and leaders, we need to be advocating, relentlessly advocating, and not just when it's convenient, advocating that what safe electrical work looks like. And ultimately, we want to arm managers and leaders with the passion to be vocal advocates for safety. Why work safe? Why is it important? There's some key benefits of adopting safe work practices. One, we want to send everybody home at the end of the day. We've all heard this, we've all said this. And it's a great kind of North Star to guide to. Secondly, is we all want to work in excellent organizations, and part of doing that means we have to recognize that safety and operational excellence cannot exist in absence of one another. They are two sides of the same coin. And sometimes you'll hear, and I've been guilty of this, is you say, oh, I'm a good electrician. I know what I'm doing. I don't need to worry about that. And we take shortcuts and we find ways to rationalize bad decisions based on, quote unquote, I know what I'm doing. And that's an old fashioned way of thinking. And we really need to and that's why it's important for managers to champion these initiatives, because it's important for us to say, we're not being safe just when it's convenient. We're doing this all the time. This is the way that we do business. And what that means is that by developing these robust programs is that we are able to reduce rework, we're able to reduce work stoppages, and overall, we are reducing operational costs. So we're giving our customers more value for their money. We're delivering projects on time with less negative impact. And I kind of glossed on this a second ago. It's important that managers and leaders have 100% buy-in. We need to be vocal and enthusiastic advocates for safety. I can't say it any plainer than that. We need to resist the urge to say, well, just get it done. And ultimately, the bottom line, the message that I want to, like, if you take nothing else away, we don't want to wait till we have some type of catastrophic accident to get serious about safety. It's important to recognize that working safely earns us the right to be in business. This gives us our license to operate. If we're going out, if we're getting people hurt, we have no business being in business. And it's important that we recognize that. It's also important that we work to reverse outdated mentalities. And I alluded to this on the last slide, where we'll say, I'm a good technician, I don't have to be safe, it's okay to cut corners. And to a person, we've all been guilty of this. And it's important as leaders to recognize it, number one, and two, to coach, to coach this out of existence, to say, part of, kind of like what I said before, being a good electrician is being a safe electrician. You cannot be one or the other. You have to be both. And that means, as leaders, we need to understand that our commitment to safety is more than just going through the motions. It's more than like token training or token documentation. It means that we are honoring the trust and responsibility given to us as stewards of our organization's resources. And we talked about capital resources, but importantly, more importantly is the human resources, the people that come to work and the people that are doing the work have entrusted us with their well-being just as much as the organization has entrusted us with their financial resources. So it's important that we recognize this, and it's important that we honor that trust that's been imparted upon us. I want to switch gears a little bit and discuss documentation. And when you're going through the 70E, you'll find where it often requires us to document aspects of our program. And why is this important? Well, documented policies and procedures defines expectations. And we all know the guy, old Bob has been here for 30 years. He knows where everything's at. He knows how to do everything. He knows all of the kind of the ins and outs of the facility. And if Bob were to go to a different organization, if he were to move on or retire, this creates a huge gap in our organizational knowledge. And that's why it's important to have these well-documented procedures, is that it maintains that level of organizational knowledge. It also reduces training time. And it's very important is that we recognize that it establishes a baseline set of expectations. And what I mean by that is when we have documented policies and procedures, the organization and everybody in it kind of knows that we're all moving in the same direction with the same goal, with the same objectives in mind. And that's really important. Another thing is documentation demonstrates our commitment to stewardship. And I talked about this before, and I continue to kind of harp on this throughout this training. Are we doing the things that we say we're doing? Well, if you don't document it, do you know? You don't know. If you don't document it, did it happen? And if you don't measure your performance, how do you know organizationally and to the individual level if you're improving? Are you moving in the right direction? And if you're not documenting your progress, you really don't know. So everything we've talked about up to this point kind of focuses right here. 70E defines the employer responsibilities as establishing and documenting and implementing safety-related work practices and procedures required by the standard. Establish means, like we talked about before, is that we are setting clear expectations, and documenting means that we're measuring the performance against those expectations. And it also means that documentation means that the policies and procedures, our work practices, are more than just word of mouth. It's not an oral tradition of business. It means that excellent organizations have well-defined, well-documented, well-established business processes. And that's what this is requiring us to do. And that's why it's an employer responsibility and not something it's not a responsibility that we defer to the employee. Second expectation, or second responsibility, I should say, is that we provide employees with training in the employer's safety-related work practices and procedures, which means that we establish, document, and implement policies and procedures, but we also train the people doing the work on what those expectations are. And that means it's more than token training. It's like, oh yeah, once a year we're going to sit down, we're going to go through an arc flash or a shock hazard training. It really means that, if in the course of my work, if I have to rack out a breaker, or if I have to open up a 480 switchgear, that I understand what that work looks like, what are the hazards associated with that work, and how do I mitigate that? How do I do that work in a safe way? And it's more than just saying, oh yeah, you sat through a class. It's really is if my work involves me to rack out a breaker, do I have a line item documented where it shows that I've demonstrated that I can do this, that I understand all the work policies? And if we're not going into that level of detail and documenting our training, then we're really doing a disservice for our people. Employee responsibilities, and according to the code, the employee responsibility is to comply with the safety related work practices and procedures provided by the employer. And you might see that and say, well, that doesn't seem right, because safety is an individual responsibility. And that certainly is true, but from an organizational standpoint, it's an abdication of responsibility. As leaders, we need to come to grips with the idea that we own the safety program, we own the safety processes. It's our responsibility to make sure the people that are working for us, under us, with us, are doing things in the right way. And anything less than that is an abdication of your responsibility as a leader. We are going to pivot into the discussion of the hierarchy of risk control methods. And what this is basically is we identify a risk and we apply controls. And a lot of times we'll be like, well, we kind of default to PPE. It's like, well, what PPE are we wearing? Well, it's important as leaders is that we recognize there are other controls that we need to be considering implementing. And we're going to take a few minutes to discuss that. So we're going to work our way from the top down and start with elimination and substitution. So elimination means we are going to remove the hazard, and substitution means that we are going to replace the hazard with something else. And these are problematic, especially in existing facilities, because this is something that you would tend to do during the design before you break ground or go into the build phases. We design a system, we say, okay, what hazards exist, and we identify those hazards before we've erected anything, and we'll say, okay, is there a way to eliminate that? Is there a way to substitute that for something else? And so that, for that reason, is something that's really difficult to do in existing facilities, because a lot of times it would require some type of retrofit. So unlike elimination and substitution, engineering controls do not remove the hazard. And that's important to understand the distinguishing feature there. But it does isolate people from the hazard. And this may look like machine guards and covers, remote operators. And what I mean by that is like remote racking tools, remote breaker operations. Anytime we can do that remotely, we want to implement that into our controls. The next one is administrative controls, and this is what we talk about a lot: policies, procedures. And this is easier to implement in existing processes. This means that we recognize an issue, we recognize a new hazard, and we can quickly pivot to address that through our policies and procedures. Unfortunately, this is subject to human error, because as humans, we're all likely to make mistakes. And PPE, for the same reason, is kind of it's also subject to human error. Do people understand the expectations? Do people understand how to select PPE? Are we choosing the right PPE? And a lot of times people think of PPE as just the things that we wear. So arc flash, gloves, shields, balaclava, all those things, like the HRC PPE, but it also means our portable barricades. Are we erecting barricades to establish our boundaries? Are we applying signage? So those are other forms of PPE, like I call it off-person PPE. So it's important to understand that the hierarchy of controls is arranged from most effective at the top to least effective at the bottom. And I've said this to people and I've had them say, well, it's kind of weird because PPE seems to be the thing that we focus on the most, but it's the least effective control. And that's accurate. So ideally, we want to create a program where we're layering controls. So the PPE is certainly important, but it is also the least effective. And I'll put it like this: if there's an incident, say an arc flash event, where we're wearing the PPE and that person is wearing the proper PPE and they're able to go away unharmed, we haven't mitigated the risk. So the risk is that an arc flash event occurs. That's still there. The PPE just happened to protect the person. Are there other things that we can implement through our policies and procedures, engineering controls that didn't put the person there in the first place or could have removed the hazard completely? And 70E says the hazard elimination shall be the first priority in the implementation of safety related work practices. So number one is we need to find ways to eliminate the hazards. If we can't do that, then can we substitute? Can we apply engineering controls? And then at the very bottom of that list are our administrative and PPE controls. So we're going to segue into the elements of an electrical safety program. So NFPA70e Article 110 states that the employer shall implement and document an overall electrical safety program that directs activity appropriate to the risk associated with electrical hazards. The electrical safety program shall be implemented as part of the employer's overall occupational health and safety management system when one exists. And I've highlighted like words like shall and document, and I've put those in bold, and those are not in code. They're not bolded in code. I've bolded these myself because it's kind of the theme that we've developed through the course of this training is how important it is that we set expectations for documenting the things that we're doing. And everybody knows shall. If you're At least I say everybody involved in the electrical industry understands that in the code when you say shall, it's not something that's optional. This is defined as you will do this. This is codified through code. So with that being said, it's important to understand as we go kind of reflect on our hierarchy of controls that the electrical safety program, as important as it is also an administrative control. So what are the components of an effective electrical safety program? And we'll go into each of these in a little bit in more detail later, but it's inspection, condition of maintenance, awareness, self-discipline, the electrical safety program principles, electrical safety program controls, program procedures, a risk assessment procedure, job safety planning, job briefings, incident investigations, auditing, and finally training. Inspection. So I'm not going to read this verbatim. I'm just going to paraphrase. This establishes the requirement for us to inspect and verify that new installations meet the codes and standards prior to being placed into service. An electrical safety program needs to verify condition of maintenance, and this gets overlooked a lot. We need to look at our current equipment and determine, is it properly installed? Is it properly maintained? Is it used in accordance with manufacturer's instructions? Is the equipment secure? Are all covers in place and secure? And is there any evidence of impending failure? This all seems like common sense stuff, and a lot of it is, but it's something that we tend to overlook, especially in regards as you'll see in future slides, is that when we talk about doing risk assessments, it's very important that we take the condition of our equipment into account. Awareness and self-discipline. This component is basically saying is we have the responsibility to communicate the hazards that our workers are going to be exposed to. So in the course of work, if we have a task that exposes us to 480 volt equipment or if it exposes us to a DC arc potential, it's our responsibility as leaders to create awareness to the employees doing the work. The program shall be developed to provide the required self-discipline for all employees. Uh, that means, do we know what the risks are? Have we trained people to identify the hazards? And have we trained people to identify the proper mitigation strategies for those hazards? And finally, the program shall instill safety principles and controls. So principles and controls, I want to go into that in a little bit more detail. What does that mean? So the electrical principles, or the principles of our electrical safety program, are basically our core tenets or our core values. What do we want to achieve? And some examples of that we kind of touched on a little bit is we want to inspect and evaluate electrical equipment. We want to plan every job. We want to de-energize. We want to anticipate things that might happen. And these are just I'm not going to read all of these, but these are just kind of our core pillars of what they can be, our core pillars of what we want our electrical safety program to be or to achieve. Electrical safety program controls, this kind of goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of the module, where we are establishing, documenting, measuring, and auditing the controls that our electrical safety program is based on. And I've listed some examples here. I'm not going to read through each of these, but it's just basically saying, okay, we have a program. How are we ensuring that we are meeting the goals, the expectations, and the objectives of our program? So the next component that we're going to discuss is program procedures. An electrical safety program shall identify the procedures to be utilized before work is started by employees exposed to an electrical hazard. And that may mean a procedure used to actually say we want to isolate a piece of switchgear. That might be a procedure. Or we even go further back into the planning process where we're going to do a job safety briefing, or we're going to do a risk assessment. There may be a procedure for doing risk assessment, and that's a kind of an example of what we mean by procedures. And you'd be surprised how often you go to a facility and they say, well, what happens if you need to isolate that piece of equipment? Well, we just hit the e-stop and put a tag on it, or we don't really have a codified, documented way of doing this work. We just do it because it's the way we've always done it, and it's kind of been passed down in an oral tradition. And we're seeing less and less of this now, but it still happens at an alarming frequency. So the next component is the risk assessment procedures. The electrical safety program shall include a risk assessment procedure and shall comply with 110.1H1 through 110.1H3. And those are the elements of a risk assessment procedure. And it's pretty simple. We need to identify the hazard. Is it an arc flash? Is it shock? Is it look-alike equipment? Or is it blind reaching? So we need to identify what those hazards are, what they might be, assess the risk. So risk is the combination, is a function of the hazard and the frequency. And that's really, in a nutshell, what the risk is. And we want to implement risk controls according to the hierarchy risk of control methods. So we talk about, elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE, kind of what we talked about a few minutes ago. And a risk assessment procedure should also include human error. If we say, this is a 125-volt battery string and it's exposed, and the code says that our limited or restricted approach boundary is to not touch it. Well, do we need to factor in what if the person's walking past it and they stumble or they trip? So we need to factor in the human error into our risk assessment processes. The job safety plan component is kind of the culmination of all the components that we've discussed up to this point. So basically, we're saying, do we have a description of the work? What's our scope? What are our hazards? What controls are we going to put in place? What procedures are we going to use? Are there any special precautions? Are there any energy sources that we need to control? couple key things here. It's important that the job safety plan is completed by a qualified person, and it's also important that the job safety plan is documented. So the job briefing is where we take the job safety plan and we put it into action. And it's kind of based on our duty as leaders to inform the workers. So we need to make sure that we communicate awareness. And that's one of our key components is awareness, is that we create awareness to that we cover the job safety plan, the information on the energized electrical work permit if that's required, and that's going to be determined by your risk assessment. So the next component is changes in scope, and it's important to understand that if we're doing work and something changes or something unexpected comes up and where it changes the scope of the things that we need to do, that we stop doing the work, that we evaluate that change, and if there's any new risks that have been created, and that we brief and raise awareness and plan the proper mitigation strategies around that change. Incident investigations. This component is something that we hope we never need, but we do need to have a mechanism in place for to investigate anything that can, and that doesn't just mean injuries. If there's say an arc flash happens in the middle of the night and nobody's around, a breaker blows up or a switch blows up, we need to be able to investigate that and to determine root causes. And it's important that our program recognizes and understands that requirement. So auditing is the final component of the electrical safety program, and basically this serves as kind of a watchdog for the entire program, and it's basically saying we've established and implemented our processes and our procedures. Are we doing the things that we say we're doing? One, and two, are those things effective? And it's important that we measure that to say, are the processes that we've put in place effective? Are people following them? Do we need more training? Do we need to amend those processes? And it's important that, and we're going to go into the next 3 slides talking about this. So field work, we need to audit work in progress to make sure that people are implementing controls, following processes, and if they're not, we need to understand that, and we need to apply if that's training, if that's reestablishing expectations, if that is maybe amending processes, maybe they're too complex. If people aren't following the processes, it's not I talked about this back in the beginning of the module, where we say, well, it's an individual responsibility. It's not really a fair statement, and we're doing our people and ourselves a disservice by saying that if people aren't following our processes, there's a reason, and we need to find out what that is. Are they too complex? Do they not understand them? Are the expectations not being set? Is the language not clear? So that's what the function of the audit is to audit these things and find out where our breakdowns are. We find out before there's an event. So this is hopefully to create a leading indicator of where our breakdowns are. Because I'm certain if you say that you don't have any breakdowns in your processes, then you're not going out there, you're not observing work, and you're not really being honest about the nature of the way people work. So we've established the expectation to audit field work. We also need to understand that we need to audit our lockout tagout program and the associated procedures. And we didn't really go into the lockout tagout program. That's the subject of another training module. But it's important to understand in this module that there is an expectation that we establish an auditing guideline for that program and those associated procedures. And finally, this should come as no surprise, is that when we audit something, it's important that we document what we're doing. And that helps us in a couple ways, and we've talked about this before, and I believe really strongly in this. And it's not just that we don't view documentation, especially in regards to auditing, as just an administrative exercise. It's important to understand that this is a valuable tool in determining the performance of our program, the performance of our processes. And lastly, we need to audit our comprehensive electrical safety program at intervals not to exceed 3 years. And why is that? It's simply because the standards change. NFPA70e is revised every 3 years. So we need to make sure that we're auditing our program, making sure that our program meets the current standards. NFPA 70E 110.2 goes into electrical safety training requirements for employees who are exposed to electrical safety hazards that are not reduced to a safe level by the applicable electrical installation requirements. Basically, we're saying that employees shall be trained, one, to understand and recognize specific hazards associated with the electrical energy. They need to be trained in safety-related work practices and procedural requirements as necessary to provide protection from electrical hazards associated with their respective jobs or task assignments. So basically what we're saying is if you have an employee that has a specific task that has some type of electrical hazard associated with it, then they need to be trained to recognize, understand, apply the proper mitigation techniques, use the proper safety related work practices, and understand the procedural requirements for the work that they're doing. Throughout Article 110.2, the NFPA 70E will reference a qualified person. And before we get too far ahead, we need to understand what a qualified person is. And if we go back to Article 100 in the definitions, we'll find that a qualified person is one who has demonstrated skills and knowledge particular to the equipment that they're working on. And in addition to that, they've also received safety training to identify hazards and reduce the associated risk. Now, I've bolded two key words here, demonstrated and received. And received kind of goes back to what we've been talking about throughout the course of this module, is where we're receiving training, we're documenting, and how important that is. But how do you demonstrate skills? And that can be done through a couple of ways. One, if you observe somebody performing the work in a safe and workmanlike manner, that's a demonstration of skill. You can also demonstrate skills through oral and written tests. But back to the definition of qualified person, we've established that a qualified person will be trained and knowledgeable for the specific for the operation of the specific equipment, and that they'll be trained to identify and mitigate the associated hazards. But 110.2 goes on to say that such persons shall also be familiar with the proper use of special precautionary techniques, applicable electrical policies and procedures, PPE, insulating and shielding materials, and insulated tools and test equipment. So this places a bigger burden on what a qualified person is expected to do. And it's not just, hey, I know how to do the work, I know how to do the work in a workmanlike manner. It's that the qualified person, it's important that they really have a foundational understanding of the hierarchy of control, how to implement that, how to assess risk, how to implement those proper controls. And if you remember a few slides back where we talked about doing a job safety plan, the expectation is that a qualified person basically identifies risks, implements the proper controls, and executes the job safety plan, the job safety briefing. It's important to note that a person can be considered qualified with respect to certain equipment and tasks, but be unqualified for others. So if you have work in a data center where you have somebody that is familiar with switchgear, they know how to isolate switchgear, but they don't know a lot about UPSs. So it's possible that through the course of their training or through the course of their career that they can say, hey, you've demonstrated proficiency for doing this particular work in a safe and workmanlike manner, but you have yet to demonstrate that proficiency on equipment B. So therefore, you're qualified on one piece of equipment, but not on this one. And 110.2 goes on to place additional expectations upon the qualified person. So if we're doing work and we're working the limited approach boundary, so at a minimum, we need to be additionally trained in all of the following. We need to be able to distinguish exposed, energized electrical conductors and circuit parts from other parts of the electrical equipment. We need to have the skills and techniques necessary to determine the nominal voltage of exposed energized conductors. We need to understand the approach distances specified in Table 130.4 for AC and DC voltages, and the corresponding voltages to which the qualified person will be exposed. So this talks about being a qualified person means more that I know how to do this work. It basically means almost more importantly is that we really have a strong grasp on what are the risks, what are the mitigation strategies, what are the boundaries. And we talked about in the last slide, the qualified person is expected to be able to do job safety planning, identify electrical hazards, assess the risks, and select the appropriate risk control methods from the hierarchy of controls. And that includes PPE, of course. And a couple slides back, we talked about how a qualified person can be qualified or considered qualified for one specific task, but not qualified for the other. So what about people that are undergoing on-the-job training? And the NFPA is clear on this. And basically what we're saying is that you can be considered to be a qualified person if you're undergoing OJT, when certain circumstances are met, and basically you have to be undergoing OJT for the purpose of obtaining the skills and knowledge necessary to be considered a qualified person. And the reason we do that is we don't want to just say, hey Johnny, you might be HVAC mechanic, but you're on OJT and you're going to do this work under the supervision of a qualified person. It's really, the intent has to be that that person is undergoing OJT to perform this work. It's not just somebody that you grabbed that was available. It's really more of a pointed intent on what that person's role is. And another circumstance, in the course of such training, that person demonstrates an ability to perform specific duties safely at his or her level of training, and they have to be under the direct supervision of a qualified person. It's important as a qualified person that these employees are trained to select an appropriate test instrument and shall demonstrate, and I've bolded that word again because it's important, how to demonstrate how to use a device to verify the absence of voltage, including interpreting the indications provided by the device. This may be a digital multimeter or a non-contact voltage indicator. The training shall include information that enables the employee to understand it, all limitations of each instrument that might be used. So in a future training module, we would talk about say different classes of digital multimeters, when one is appropriate and when it might not be appropriate. And the employer is responsible to determine through regular supervision or through inspections, audits conducted on at least an annual basis, that each employee is complying with the safety related to work practices required by the standard. Article 110.2 goes on to define the training expectations for an unqualified person and to say that unqualified persons shall be trained and familiar with any electrical safety related practices necessary for their safety. So basically, to come out of this, the expectation is that an unqualified person needs to be aware of certain risks around in the environment that they're working in, even though they're not working on the equipment. If they're in the vicinity or if they might be exposed to it, they need to be at a minimum aware of that. As leaders and managers, it's important for us to understand that training is not a static thing, that it is a perishable skill, and as such, the NFPA70e has set guidelines for retraining. And we need to ensure people are retrained in safety-related work practices at intervals not to exceed 3 years. An employee will receive additional training or retraining if any of the following conditions exist. And basically, if supervision or annual inspection indicates the employee is not complying with safety-related work practices, there's new technology, new equipment, or the procedures change. Because we know we're always learning. It's a growing industry, so we're learning new things about safety. We're learning new ways of doing things. So as the industry evolves, we can expect to have to provide new training to our people. The employee needs to review tasks that are performed less often than once per year. So if we're doing a plant shutdown and we only do it once every 18 months, 2 years, 36 months, it's important that everybody involved is trained, understands what their role is, what the scope of the job is, what the hazards are. The employee needs to review safety-related work practices not normally used by the employee during regular job duties. So this basically, hey, my job is to, do this thing, and I'm doing something that's a little unfamiliar. It's important that we identify that risk and train our employees appropriately. Or if the employee's job duty changes, and of course, we need to make sure that they get onboarded to those new roles. Now, one thing we kind of glossed over is that if the supervision or annual inspections indicate the employee is not complying with the safety-related work practices. So this goes back to how we document and milestone our program. Are our procedures documented? Are we doing our audits? Are our audits documented? Because only through those mechanisms can we really get a deep understanding of how we are performing against our program. Article 110.2 goes on to outline types of training, and the training required by the article shall be classroom, on the job, or a combination of the two. The type and extent of the training provided shall be determined by the risk to the employee. Basically what we would do is, from a program standpoint, we say, okay, hey, what kind of work do we do? What are those risks? And develop a training plan based on that, based on is that the employees understand the risks that they're exposed to, the expectations of their roles, and that we develop a comprehensive line item training program around that. And Article 110.2 also discusses documentation, so we're going to harp on this some more. The employer shall document that each employee has received the training required by 110.2a. This documentation shall be in accordance with the following. It'll be made when the employee demonstrates proficiency in the work practices. It'll be retained for the duration of the employee's employment, and it'll contain the content of the training, each employee's name, and the dates that they were trained. Your employees also need to receive training in lockout-tagout procedures. In the initial training, if your employees are involved in or affected by the lockout-tagout procedures, they need to be trained in the following: what the procedures are and their responsibility in the execution of the procedure. And there may be times where retraining is required, and this is not a punitive thing. And we talk about training and retraining, and a lot of times it's easy to think of this as, we're going to get you, or we're out to find somebody doing wrong. But really, retraining or identifying the need for retraining means that something in our system is not working optimally. We need to try to avoid the idea that it's this person's fault or this person is making mistakes. We all make mistakes. That's just the nature of being human. But the need for retraining is coming from gaps in our processes. So it's really important as managers that we understand that it's not punitive. It's hey, we identified a need. It's if there's a training failure, that's my responsibility. So it's really important for us as managers to take ownership of that. If there's a training gap, or if there's somebody that hasn't received or didn't understand the training, it's our responsibility to make sure that they receive that. Anyway, retraining in the lockout-tagout procedure shall be performed as follows. Whenever the procedures are revised and at intervals not to exceed 3 years, and also when supervision or annual inspections indicate that the employee is not complying with the lockout-tagout procedures. And very similar to our qualified person training, our lockout-tagout procedure training needs to be documented. The employer is responsible for documenting that each employer has received the training required, which means that the employee has demonstrated a proficiency. The documentation will contain the content of the training, each employee's name, and the dates that they were trained. On the last slide, we talked about documenting the training content, and somebody could ask, "Hey, well, what does that mean? What is documenting the content of training?" And we'll go into a little bit more detail here. And the content of the training can include one or more of the following, like a course syllabus, course curriculum, outline, a table of contents, or a list of training objectives. Employment records that indicate that an employee has received the required training are an acceptable means of meeting this requirement. Qualified workers who work within the limited approach boundary are also expected to be trained in the following areas: emergency response training, contact release, employees exposed to shock hazards, and those responsible for the safe release of victims from contact with energized electrical conductors or circuit parts shall be trained in methods of safe release. Refresher training shall occur annually. This is very important, especially when we're putting people in areas where there are recognized hazards. First aid, emergency response, and resuscitation. Employees responsible for responding to medical emergencies shall be trained in first aid and emergency procedures, CPR, use of AEDs if it's included in the employer's emergency response plan at intervals required by the certifying body. So if you're Red Cross certified for CPR, then the expectation is that you recertify at a periodicity defined by who certified you. So Red Cross would have to you'd have to requalify at those intervals. And employers are responsible for that, for ensuring that training is up to date. Employers shall verify at least annually that employee training required is current, and the employer shall document that the required training has occurred. So again, we're talking about documenting, verifying, and how important that is. And you'll see this theme recur throughout NFPA70e, especially in regards to training and documentation of policies and procedures. So that brings us to the end of this training module. And in conclusion, one, I thank you for participating and taking the time to sit through this training. I know it's a long module, but I really do appreciate you taking the time. And I hope we've achieved the stated objectives of the program. One, that we understand the hierarchy of risk. We understand how important it is for managers to take ownership of delivering an electrical safety program to their organization. That we understand the expectations around training, around documentation. And at this point, we're going to have a short feedback quiz. And it's one of those things where we do the quiz to really kind of reinforce the training that we've received over the course of this module. Thank you, and look forward to speaking with you soon.